Hi, I'm Ken Childers, a special ed teacher in training in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I've done extensive special ed subbing, which I've really enjoyed. I probably have the equivalent of about a year and a half to maybe almost 2 years of special ed teaching, often sporadic, but sometimes I've done long-term assignments. I'd like to talk a little bit about the autistic kid in the classroom and what I'm seeing in classrooms involving children with autism. Before I go on and discuss autism, I should define my terms a little bit. In the professions in the United States, although that doesn't necessarily apply everywhere, we don't use the term Asperger's very much anymore. As a matter of fact, the term Asperger's is a little bit historically controversial because of who came up with the term. But in any event, I think it's fine to use Asperger's or Aspie in common speech, and sometimes you might hear me do that. But personally, I mostly talk about people who have autism, and if it's something like Asperger's, or what used to be Asperger's, I usually just call it mild autism. I often also use the term ASD, which is Autistic Spectrum Disorder, but there are those of us in the community who think that that probably should be changed to Autistic Spectrum Condition, because it's a little less judgmental. Autism isn't always necessarily that disordering. But in any event, a lot of people these days seem to have settled on ASD, so you'll hear me use the terms autism and ASD. Sort of an interesting personal point is that I have autism. I have mild autism, and I was diagnosed about 6 or 7 years ago by a Fort Wayne, Indiana professional psychologist, and one of her 2 specialties is that. So it's a pretty firm diagnosis. I think it's interesting to have a sort of inside view of what's going on when you're watching kids and watching a classroom. One thing I'm always emphasizing about trying to teach autistic kids is people with autism are extremely sensitive to sensory phenomena. On a wonderful website, and you can get in touch with me if you want to hear more, there's a whole series of articles, and I've written some of them, many of us have responded, about oversensitivity to taste, to smells, to light, to sound. Light and sound are, of course, the big ones. And of course, classrooms in the United States of America tend to be really noisy. Studies show that up to 60 or 65% of people actually like loud talking when they're having something presented to them. That's, of course, not really in consonance with the desires of most people who have autism, including kids. Personally, I think that since there's really no need for the United States to be a noisier society, and being a little bit more quiet and introverted and collaborative and peaceful probably would be an advantage. I think it's unfortunate that a lot of our classrooms don't have sound buffering cushions on the walls. I think if you're I believe there also is sound cushioning paint, so if you're redoing a room, there's really no extra cost to putting some of this in. Putting subtle, lovely light in, like the light that I'm sitting in right now, also has 0 cost, or it's a savings, because it actually takes a little bit less electricity. I see advantages to that for the gen ed kids as well as autistic kids. So it fits into the general paradigm of universal design for learning. That really is something that could apply to almost all the kids. And of course, once in a while you could crank up the sound, hopefully high quality sound, if you wanted to. Going beyond what I see in the physical environment for autistic kids, I wanted to talk about sort of like the curriculum and what your typical autistic kid faces when he or she is in a classroom. We tend to like rote and repetition. For example, when I was in elementary school, I would often finish my work and I was done with a fork. The typical American response to that has been, well, review your work, reread. Often I had reviewed my work and reread, really to not perfection, but almost as much as you could take it. So I would sit and read encyclopedias. And I remember a teacher telling me, Kenneth Childers, will you stop reading encyclopedias in my classroom? Well, these sort of splinter interests and splinter abilities are not necessarily something we should be discouraging among our autistic kids, be they very high functioning or the quote-unquote more impaired or lower functioning autistic kids. By the way, I wanted to say something about that. We're really not sure about the statistics on autism. We are fairly sure that more kids have autism than we would have thought 10 or 20 years ago, but that's just because we have better diagnostic tools. There's also this new idea that a good chunk of people with autistic traits don't really have autism, they just have autistic tendencies, sometimes called BAP or broader autistic phenotype. And if autism follows a skewed statistical distribution, in other words, an upward curve, a rounded upward curve, that would mean that people with autism are probably, maybe 20 or 30% of the curve, and people with just mild cases are all the rest. But those of us sort of in that boat have needs too. But getting back to the general subject of the curriculum and how it relates to autistic kids, I'm not sure that we've done a terrific job tailoring the curriculum and the interests of the kids towards them. We've probably done a better job giving autistic kids extra time, not rushing them, but even then, I see a substantial amount of rushing of autistic kids, breaking off their rote and repetitious behaviors. I have one kid who comes and asks repetitive questions week after week. He's really a great student and I work well with him. My response is to answer. And then when he asks a second time, I'll say something like, well, haven't you already asked that? And he'll say, I see. He might not say yes or no. He'll say, I see. And I'll say, well, what was my answer? And then he'll stop asking. So that's sort of the prompt. But I see some other team members, teaching team members, if you want to put it that way, be very harsh towards such behaviors, even giving disciplinary steps or what have you. I'm not sure that that's really good practice or policy. And I'm not really sure that it's quite the customized education that I'd like to see. And a final thing that I think we almost never see, at least here in Indiana, and I think probably nowhere, is the rules and the ropes of neuronormal society. Neuronormal society being, well, everybody who's not wired up in the brain in a really atypical fashion, so about 85% of the society. It helps enormously when you can just tell someone with autism, and their level is going to depend on how you say it. You know, here's a rule of neuronormal society. Neuronormal people often A, B, and C. And they do it for this reason, or there's no reason, and it's incredibly annoying if you have autism, but it just is that way. So I'd like to see more of that. I'm not sure why we don't, maybe time constraints, curriculum. I don't think it's a question of counseling, because that sort of thing isn't really psychological counseling. You have to be very ginger in the schools at giving that. Only trained professionals can give that. But what I just said is the sort of stuff I do think we could give it. But sadly, it's very rarely seen. So we've made tremendous strides in autistic education, even in the 15 years that I've been subbing on and off. But there's still quite a ways to go, as there is in terms of universal design for learning in general. So those are my thoughts. You're welcome to contact me with any questions. And that concludes my talk on this topic. Thank you.